Hi, everyone, and welcome again to our Bible study on the book of Genesis. So, last week we covered Genesis chapter 14, and in that chapter we saw that Abraham reached a point where he was able to fight for his brother, right? Fight for Lot. So, as we have covered before and emphasized, the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob correspond to our spiritual journey, right? Our spiritual experience. So far in Abraham, we see God's calling, right? God called us. Abraham, we see that we are able to live by faith. We see also that we have trials in our daily life, right? And these trials help to strengthen our faith, right? And our faith is strengthened, we are able to intercede for our brothers, pray for our brothers. So last week we saw how Abraham was able to trust in God, to experience God as the possessor of heaven and earth, right? So we, in our spiritual journey, our spiritual experience, we need to come to a point where we can experience God as the possessor of heaven and earth, of all things, and trust in Him to the point where we would fight for our fellow believers who we see are in difficult situations. So now we come to Genesis chapter 15. And in this chapter, we see a turn in Abraham's experience with God, right? So prior to Genesis chapter 15, all Abraham's experiences were outward, right? For instance, him being called, it was by God, experiencing God by living by faith, right? So he trusted in God for his living, but this is outward. Even Abraham experiencing um, receiving all the riches, that's something that's outward, right? But here in Genesis chapter 15, we see a turn. So in this chapter, Jehovah appeared to Abraham in a vision, and he told Abraham, do not be afraid, right? So the previous chapter, Abraham fought 4 kings, right? So he must have been afraid after, like, maybe they would come for me. So this is why Jehovah told him, do not be afraid. And Jehovah told him, I am your shield and your great reward. So Abraham had something on his heart. What was on his heart? It was the seed, right? God promised him earlier that in him all the nations will be blessed, right? So Abraham told Jehovah, well, I go seedless, right? I don't have a child. Like, so is Eliezer, my servant, is that my seed, my child? So this shows that Abraham, because of his previous experience with God, he was still thinking outward, right? He was still thinking, well, God, you will bless me with something outward, outside of me. But Jehovah told him, no, Abraham, the seed will come from you, right? From your own body, right? So this was something inward, right? And he brought him outside and he told him, look at the stars of the heaven, right? If you are able to count them, so shall your seed be. And Genesis 15:6, it says, and Abraham believed Jehovah, and he accounted to him as a righteousness. So Abraham's faith in Genesis chapter 15 was a faith that accounted him as righteous. So prior to chapter 15, Abraham believed in God as the possessor of heaven and earth, as the one who would supply all his need. That's really good faith, right? But this is not the faith that's counted as righteousness. The faith that's counted as righteousness is the faith in Genesis chapter 15. The faith which is to bring forth the seed, right? So in this chapter, we see 2 things, the seed and the land, right? So when Abraham believed God to bring forth the seed, this was counted as righteousness. And as we see in the book of Galatians, right? Galatians 3, this seed is Christ, right? And actually, it's Christ through the Spirit. in Galatians 3:14, right? So we are blessed by receiving the Spirit. So coming back to Genesis 15, so Abraham's turn now was to believe God would work something into him to produce a seed. Because at that time they had no children, right? His wife was barren, actually. She couldn't have children. They couldn't have any kids. So it wasn't a small thing to believe that God would work something into him to produce a seed that would be as the stars in the heaven, right? So how does that relate to us? As believers, we need to go on from just trusting in God as our supplier, right? For our daily necessities, for our bread, all of this is good, right? To believe Him as the one who would work out something within us, right? Work out this seed within us, right? That Christ would be produced within our being. We would express Christ, right? This is the faith that God accounts as righteousness, right? And this is salvation. Salvation is receiving Christ as the seed and letting this seed grow within us so we can express the seed. So Abraham believed this. But then when you go further in the chapter, then he told him about the land, and Abraham didn't believe the land, right? He asked Jehovah, how will I inherit this land, right? So then the scene here is quite strange, right? We see that Jehovah made a covenant with Abraham because Abraham was not sure about the promise, so God doubled down with a covenant, right? So what is the seed? We already said the seed is Christ, right? And what is the land, right? The land, the promised inheritance. So this one is a little hard to figure out, right? But if you read the book of Colossians, we see that the land is also Christ, right? In Colossians 1:12, Paul said, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us for a share of the allotted portion of the saints in the light, right? So he's likening Christ to this portion, right, of the saints, right? And then in Colossians 2, we see Paul said that we should not be defrauded of our prize, right? We should walk in this Christ, and we shouldn't let anyone take us away from our stand on this land, which is Christ, right? So the seed is Christ, right? And the land is also Christ, right? So in Genesis, Abraham didn't know what his seed or how his seed would bless the nations, but we see that this seed, singular, is Christ, right? And the blessing is Christ as a spirit within us. So by faith, when we receive the Lord Jesus, we receive this seed, right? But what should we do with this seed? We should let the seed grow, right? By nurturing it, and also we should enjoy Christ as our portion, as our land. We should walk in Him. We shouldn't let anyone defraud us of this land. So when you go on to read in the Old Testament, we see that many times the children of Israel were defrauded of the land. They lost their stand in the land, and they have to go back to the proper standing on the land. So this is also a type of Christ, right? So in this lesson, we see that God's purpose is fulfilled. God's eternal purpose is fulfilled through the seed and the land, right? So what is God's eternal purpose? So God's purpose is to have a people to express Him with His image and to represent Him with His dominion. So in Genesis 1:26, we see this, right? Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let him have dominion, right? So as we covered this, the first man, Adam, failed, right? But then Christ came as the last Adam, this seed of Abraham, right, to fulfill God's purpose, right? So when we receive Christ, right, this one who bears the image of the invisible God, and we express Christ, we grow in this one, then we are able to fulfill God's eternal purpose, which is to express God and represent God. So with that, I think you could read it in the description below, and we'll have some more discussion about knowing grace for the fulfillment of God's purpose through the seed, which is Christ, and through the land, which is also Christ. Thank you.